Hello. Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I want to offer a special thank you to our viewers at home or wherever they may be on the library's YouTube channel. I'm Carrie Coogan. I'm Deputy Director for Community Engagement and Public Affairs here at the library, and we're so glad to have you here tonight for our powerful and timely conversation, one that sits squarely at the intersection of climate, agriculture, and the food on our plates. We're honored to host two extraordinary journalists who have spent their careers pulling back the curtain on systems that shape our world. And I'm honestly thrilled to begin by introducing one of them, an investigative journalist with very deep roots in Missouri, born and raised here in Kansas City, a national reputation for fearless revelatory reporting, Chris Leonard. Chris is the author of 3 critically acclaimed books that dive deep into power, policy, and profit. The Meat Racket exposed the corporate consolidation of America's food industry. Cokeland offered a decade-long investigation into one of the country's most secretive and influential private empires, the Koch family. And the Lords of Easy Money revealed how Federal Reserve policy is reshaping inequality and risk in the American economy. Beyond his best-selling books, Chris is shaping the future of journalism right here in Missouri. Through his leadership of the Watchdog Writers Group at the University of Missouri School of Journalism, he's mentored a new generation of investigative reporters committed to long-form, nonfiction storytelling that speaks truth to power, especially when it's hard. Tonight's conversation brings that same spirit of scrutiny and urgency to one of the biggest environmental questions of our time. How do we fix a global food system that is quite literally eating the earth? Chris will be in conversation with Michael Grunwald, a fellow journalist and best-selling author whose latest book, We Are Eating the Earth, also for sale, and explores the often overlooked climate impact of agriculture and the bold ideas that scientists, entrepreneurs, and policymakers are proposing to help feed the world without destroying it. Before we begin, though, I hope you'll mark your calendars for the next installment of our Watchdog Writers Group series next month in August. Journalist and professor Caleb Gale joins us to discuss his new book, Black Moses, a saga of ambition and the fight for a black state, which tells the story of one man's extraordinary campaign to create a self-governed black state within the US, specifically in Oklahoma, where he lived for 18 years. And Pulitzer Prize-winning Pulitzer Prize-winning finalist, Shoshana Walter, will be here to share Rehab, an American Scandal, her searing investigation into the country's deeply broken response to the opioid crisis and the corruption running through the rehab industry. So with that, I hope that you will follow these conversations, and after this conversation tonight, we'll open it up for questions. So please feel free to step up to microphones that will be placed up at the front. And if you're watching online, you can put your questions in the YouTube chat. As I mentioned, we'll be selling the book afterwards, and Michael will be signing it as well. And so now it is my great pleasure to welcome to the stage both Chris Leonard and Michael Grunwald.
Good departure. All right, thank you, Carrie. Hey. Hello. Well, I sank down in the chair. I can kind of see the people in the back, so. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming here. I'm Chris Leonard, as was introduced, and I'm here with my great friend, Michael Grunwald, to talk about his new book. Quickly, I do have to say, Carrie mentioned the Watchdog Writers Group, and it's a program at the Missouri J School that has two sides to it. We give grants to authors to write really deeply reported books in the public interest, and then we hire students at the journalism school to help them report the books, so the students get mentorship and reporting. Michael crossed the finish line first. He's our first author to have a book come out. And his student is in the audience tonight, Jana Rose Schleiss. If you could please stand up for a second. I'm not trying to embarrass Jana, but one of the coolest things about this program that I tell everybody is the next generation of reporters is unendingly inspiring to me. They're idealistic, they're driven, they're hardworking. Jana did a hero's work helping Michael investigate regenerative agriculture, which we're going to talk about. And I really do have bright hopes for the future of journalism, believe it or not. So, okay, with that, let's get into this book. There's nothing I hate more at a book talk when an author gives someone gives a long-winded introduction, okay? But I'm compelled to do this because I'm introducing Michael, and I've been hearing about this book for years in the program with Michael as he works through this. I've read drafts of the material, and last week I reread the whole final book, and it really hit me. I'm coming in hot tonight with a lot to say because this book is extraordinarily important, and it's also an excellent book. I strongly recommend you read it. It's an incredible story that also has an incredible message I think we all need to hear. And it's my job to introduce Michael and introduce the book. And it's going to be a little long-winded, but I promise you this all ties into the themes of our discussion tonight. So Michael, I describe him to my friends as the Forrest Gump of modern print journalism in America. He's worked everywhere. He knows everybody. He's covered everything. And his career started in the 90s. He worked at the Boston Globe during the 1990s. Then he moved to the Washington Post for the 2000s, where he's a national affairs reporter, if I'm not wrong. From there, he went to Time Magazine, where I think he worked for 7 years as a national correspondent. And after that, he went to Politico magazine, where he was a national affairs writer. And then after that, has been pretty focused on the issue of climate and the climate crisis. He founded and ran a podcast called Climavores and worked for an upstart digital news outlet called Canary Media that focuses on climate change. Now he is a contributing editorial writer at the New York Times writing about climate issues. But along the way, he also produced 2 excellent books, The Swamp about the Everglades in Florida, and then The New Deal about the Obama administration with kind of a focus on climate technology and subsidies to that. Excellent books, highly recommend. But what I think is pertinent to our talk tonight, and what I think is important about Michael, is not just the places he's worked and the incredible jobs you've had and the accolades you've won, but the kind of reporter you are. When we were driving over here, Michael dropped this term casually about the core values of journalism. And I think you actually embody these core values really deeply. Michael's a fair reporter, he's a deep reporter, and all of his stories focus on issues in the public interest, not political food fights, not entertainment. But Michael's developed this reputation over the decades as the policy story guy, the complicated issues guy, the Byzantine government agency story guy. That's correct, right? And yeah. And I think what saves you, because most of the media skirts around these stories, like the one we're going to talk about tonight, because they're worried that Americans' eyes are going to glaze over when we get down into the machinery and the policies that affect our lives. But Michael has this ability to get in there and bring these things to life. I think it's because he's a really funny writer in part and also a great writer. At one point in the book, he describes the Army Corps of Engineers as a battalion of concrete-addicted marauders. So many great turns of phrase in this book that make me sick with jealousy, to be honest, because I wish I'd thought of them myself. And what's emerged over time, and I'm going to shut up, but it's really important to this book, is there's such a thing as a Grunwaldian story. And it dives into these complicated issues that affect us. Usually the conclusions that come from it don't cleave neatly into these lines we see on cable news every night of red team versus blue team. The problems are messy, the solutions are messy, and Michael is stubborn in diving into this and coming up with answers that just kind of manage to offend almost every interest group that exists in America. Is that fair? So, Michael, this book is a classic Grunwald book. So why help us understand what it's about? And I think a great point to start is how you got into this story in the first place.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I mean, I feel like maybe we should leave now because I was like, I can only go downhill from here. But I especially want to thank Chris and for the Watchdog Writers Group, because that really, aside from just being a great structure and being very generous, it was just unbelievably inspiring to, book writing is hell. And this is like, kind of having companions in hell. And particularly Chris, who is just a sort of genius of the art of the book. He understands how books unfold and how they need to work. And he certainly made mine a lot better. So I really do want to thank you.
Cheers.
And thank the library, because this is very cool. I really appreciate you guys doing this. I mean, I don't understand my understanding is that you actually give books away for free. That seems terrible. But otherwise this is really nice. So I really stumbled into this, but the short answer is that, as you said, I wrote a fair amount. I mean, I wrote a lot about policy. I wrote quite a bit since my Everglades book about the environment, which meant writing about climate. But for me, that always meant writing about energy and climate. I knew a lot about that. I had an energy column at Time magazine, and food is a third of the climate problem. It's 70% of our fresh water problem. It's a huge percentage of our biodiversity problem and our water pollution problems. And I didn't know squat about it. I knew nothing. I was just spectacularly ignorant. And essentially it kind of occurred to me, and maybe this is the Grunwaldian thing, but I don't know, there are a lot of people know a lot about energy and climate, and nobody really seems to be paying attention to food and climate. And we kind of vote on these issues 3 times a day, so people kind of care a lot about food. Maybe I should try to be less ignorant. And what was nice about it is that I can't say that I really went in with preconceived notions, because I had no notions. I knew nothing. And so it's really been a very long journey of sort of trying to educate myself and learning about this issue where, for one thing, I think it turns out that this kind of carbohydrate issue is more interesting than the hydrocarbon issue, because energy, we sort of know what we need to do, and we're even starting to do it, despite what's happening in Washington right now, but globally, we're moving towards a clean energy economy, so it's now really mostly a political question. But food, we don't know anything. And the problem's getting worse, and I felt we didn't really even know what we needed to know. We weren't really even grappling with this stuff. So, whatever else people can say about the book, and I'm sure it'll be as unpopular as so many other things I've written, but it grapples. So, that was the idea, and I hope other people will grapple too.
And we're going to walk through it tonight. I'm going to try not to be hyperbolic tonight, but I can't...
No, I'm enjoying the hyperbole.
I can't overstate the importance of the issue we're facing with growing enough food to feed the world while ensuring we don't dramatically worsen the climate crisis and the environmental crisis. So we're going to talk about that. But when I said this book isn't just important, but it's excellent, what makes it excellent to my mind is that this is a real story. Sorry to keep using the phrase, but this is a Grunwaldian story, and this is what I mean by that. There's a main character in this book who goes on a hero's journey and a struggle. And the struggle is to do 3 things: to discover a truth, to communicate the truth to the rest of America, and then to see if we can act on this truth. And we see this amazing journey and struggle that I think illuminates so much about where we are as a country right now and our capability to confront these enormous crises. And that really almost transcends this issue, and I think that struggle is so central to the story in this book, and it speaks so much to what you've been doing as a journalist for all of these years. So let's please start from the beginning of this book, because it opens up jumping right into the lion's den, alienating one of the most powerful political constituencies and industries in our country. So talk about our main character, Tim Searchinger, and the moment when he read a major study from the Argonne National Laboratory.
Yeah, so Sergey, at the time, he was just a wetlands lawyer, and I've known him for like 25 years. And Tim is this brilliant, kind of relentless, somewhat pain in the ass type of guy, who, I remember the first time I met him, he was pushing a story about those concrete addicted marauders of the Army Corps. And what I remember is, first of all, just this kind of like blizzard of verbiage, and also that he looked like he was 12 years old, even though he was 10 years older than me, but he looked like he was wearing his dad's suit for the first time. But what really stuck with me was this kind of sort of almost naive honesty, where he would explain what the truth was, and then he would explain sort of 6 arguments that the critics would make about what he was saying, and then he would explain why 4 of them were bogus, but then one of them was not entirely bogus, but here's why it's a little bogus, and then this one is actually a good argument, and he may need to tweak. I'm just like, you're not supposed to be giving me the other side. He was a truth teller, and what he also is a figure-outer. He's a guy who's just driven to figure stuff out. And to go back to what I said at the beginning, I mean, while energy has sort of been figured out, what I realized about food is that this is a story, if energy is now a political story, food has become an analytical story. And what I had was like the perfect analyst, the guy who was determined to figure stuff out, didn't understand why everybody else wasn't as into facts and science and the truth as he was. He literally has his welcome mat at his house on the porch says "No dogmas allowed," and that's it has a picture of a dog, but he's and he's that guy. And so I was, the sort of dirty secret is sometimes like Grunwaldian is a little bit of a euphemism for, boy, this guy writes about some boring shit that nobody else cares about. And I was definitely focused on it is important to make this a compelling story. And people do like characters, and I thought that Tim would be a good guide, for me and the reader to sort of follow them through this journey.
Yeah, so we pick up Tim. He's been an environmental lawyer for decades. He's fought the Army Corps of Engineers. You wrote stories about that. But what really triggers this book is when he's reading this massive study from one of the most prestigious laboratories in the United States. Hey. And the sum conclusion of this government study is that biofuels, speaking of stepping on toes, I guess, because here we are in Missouri where agriculture is just a critical industry.
Wait until we get to livestock.
Okay, let's walk through this slowly. But he reads this government report that says, hey, biofuels are less harmful to the environment in terms of climate change than fossil fuels. So they represent to us this potential solution to the climate problem. And how does he interpret this impeccable, prestigious scientific study?
Well, and this was also the first time Tim had ever read a climate study, because he was a wetlands lawyer. He was just, he spent his time trying to fight to save the wetlands of the Midwest from agriculture, basically. And he was interested in ethanol not because he cared about the climate, but because people were talking about, various proposals to increase the amount of ethanol that was blended into gasoline, and he thought that would mean more corn and more fertilizer going into the river and more drainage of wetlands. So we just took a look at this study, and the basic argument, not to get too deep into the details, but basically it said, look, corn ethanol is a pretty inefficient way to make fuel. It uses almost as much fossil fuel as it replaces. The actual production emissions from fertilizing the corn and growing the corn and then distilling the ethanol are way more than gasoline's production emissions. But it still turns out kind of a little bit better for the climate because fossil fuels, you dig it up from underground and burn it, while corn, you burn it in the engine, but then you grow it in the field. And when you grow it through photosynthesis, it's soaking up carbon from the sky. So he was like, huh, that's okay. He was like, but wait a minute. Those fields were already growing corn. Like, they were growing corn for food, but where's the benefit of ethanol? Because, like, it's the same out of the tailpipe, and it's the same, what's happening in the field isn't changing. And you've just told me that this is like way worse than gasoline to produce. And she says, and another thing is, if you're going to grow fuel instead of food, then somewhere else you're going to need to replace the food. And it's probably not going to be like a parking lot. It's going to be a forest or a wetland. And my understanding is that they store some carbon. It just doesn't make sense. And he actually at the time sort of set it aside because he was like, oh, it just seems weird, but nobody cared because nobody cared about the climate in 2003. But by 2007, when George W. Bush was pushing this massive expansion of ethanol, and he suddenly remembered that. And at that time, this was after Al Gore's movie, and he realized, I need to take a deeper look at this because it just seemed wrong.
And he has this realization that you just hit on, that if you divert corn to the gas tank, you're going to have to replace that corn to feed livestock and to feed human beings. And what he comes up with a term for it that's abbreviated as ILUC. What does that stand for again?
Right, indirect land use change. I don't tell people that my book is about indirect land use change.
Right.
But really what he realized is that everybody who had looked at biofuels and, spoiler alert, it turns out just about everything else in a climate context, had ignored the question of land, the opportunity cost of land, the idea that if you use land to grow fuel, you can't use it to grow food, and you can't use it to store carbon. And remember, even Indiana, it used to be 85% forest, so it used to store a lot of carbon. Sort of long story short is he decided, you know what, I'm going to dig into this and do the math, and it ended up getting him basically run out of the environmental group where he had been for 17 years. But even though he was a lawyer, he published in Science, the most prestigious scientific journal, an article that basically said, they've missed the land use, and in fact, ethanol pencils out about twice as bad as gasoline, because essentially that, biofuels are eating the earth. And then, to give another spoiler alert, biofuels, it turns out, are eating about 1 Texas worth of the earth. Livestock are eating 50 Texas's worth of the earth, and agriculture is eating 75 Texas's worth of the earth. But that was the beginning of Tim's intellectual journey, this notion that land is not free, and somehow everybody is pretending that land is free.
And we're facing pressures on the finite amount of land that exists. You either use it to grow food, have houses, or soak up carbon. As forests do. And so Tim has this realization that if we start diverting billions of bushels, and I think I'm getting that number right, of corn into the fuel tank, we're going to have to start deforesting the Amazon to grow the food to replace it. But the thing is, by the time he realizes this and publishes the story in Science that puts the truth in black and white, an enormous political constituency has been built for ethanol. I mean, your book makes the corn lobby sound terrifying. Like, you do not cross the corn lobby. Presidential candidates have to go to Iowa. And I don't know, Tim, I think naive is a good word to use it because he has this expectation that if I find the truth, people are going to respond to it. And the early middle part of the book is this guy's journey of trying to get people to listen to him.
There's a funny moment early on in his ethanol journey where he goes and tries to lobby a senator to oppose this stuff, and it's actually Senator John Corzine from New Jersey. And Tim's feeling is like, there's not a lot of corn grown in New Jersey, and hey, if these ethanol mandates, all they're going to do is jack up the price of corn, which is going to make food and gasoline more expensive for people in New Jersey, just to enrich some agribusinesses like Archer Daniels Midland in the Midwest. So he goes and makes the case to one of Corzine's aides, and the guy's like, "Look, I'm sorry, Tim. My boss can't afford to. He doesn't want to offend the farmers in Iowa." And Tim's like, "Wait a minute. Your boss was the head of Goldman Sachs, the most hated corporation on the planet. Does he actually think that he's going to be president of the United States? And the aide says, Tim, they all think they're going to be president of the United States. So it's, that's just one of many stories of the ag lobby flexing its muscles. But look, we're a nation where 1% farm and 99% don't. And, the rest of us do owe that 1%, a debt, right? Like, that's why, we can write books and run fellowships and have libraries and be doctors and bankers and influencers and whatever. But that said, like, when it comes to farm and food policy, the 1% run everything. And you even saw that influence, in academic departments, agricultural economics, agricultural environmental studies were really, there was just incredible, overwhelming influence of the ag lobby and all this stuff. And I tell a bunch of stories of Tim kind of, sort of recognizing that this stuff is not exactly on the level, including with some scientists who had made their careers saying that, biofuels were a really exciting climate solution. And here was this guy came along to say, well, actually, no. And suddenly their careers were feeling a little bit useless. And just like the old, line about how, people, it's hard to get people to understand something when their salary depends on, on them not understanding it. It's also when their sort of professional self-worth depends on it. Tim had a lot of trouble convincing people, and there were a lot of, there's a chapter full of the really kind of silly and horrible and often ridiculous arguments people made to try to knock down his science. But ultimately, part of the reason I did include all that was to establish him as this truth-telling dude who, now that you've seen him tell the truth and get ignored on biofuels, wait until you see what happens with the rest of agriculture.
Yes, and we'll get there, but I thought that this part of the book was so interesting because you see this opposition to what he's trying to say, but there were a lot of scientists who saw the data, and these include scientists that had published major papers saying biofuels were better, and they reversed themselves.
Some of them, yeah, and that, I made a point of, in fact, there are sort of three heroes who I singled out, one scientist, one environmentalist, and then one, a guy who is like the head of, basically the Secretary of the Environment from Massachusetts, who are all big bioenergy supporters and were really out on record saying that this is the way to go, particularly for the climate. And essentially, once they saw Tim's work, they realized they were wrong, and they admitted they were wrong. And one reason I sort of made a point of telling their stories was because most people weren't like that.
Yeah.
And one of them, one of them has there's a shocking twist of what's happening to one of them. I'm not going to give it away. One of them just becomes, like the environmentalist just becomes, instead of like the pro-bio, like the environmentalist who's leading the charge against bioenergy, he becomes the environmentalist who's leading the charge against it. And the guy in Massachusetts had led the way on some of this bioenergy stuff, and it became the first, and it turned out the only jurisdiction to really turn against it. So part of the reason is and I was really determined not to just tell a Debbie Downer story. I think a lot of climate books are just it's all, we're screwed, it's game over for the climate, all going to hell. I don't believe that, but I also think it's really hard. And part of it was, but I also wanted to show that it's possible, and it is going to require, people doing these hard things. And I think as a species, there are things we're good at and things that we're not so good at. And I'm going to talk about that, I'm sure, tonight. One of the things we really suck at is admitting we're wrong. And so I thought it was, since the world is, as you see, I mentioned that there's a lot that people don't know about these food and climate and the earth issues. There's also a lot of stuff that people think they know that just isn't so. And so people are going to have to, they're going to have to go on similar journeys. And so I thought that was the sort of meta reason I devoted so much time to these people who saw the light.
And that's why I'm spending so much time talking about this, because I think these two crises are intertwined.
Oh, yeah.
Our ability to recognize reality in front of us, change direction, is so tied in with this problem. But Tim faces all this resistance to his research, and so decides to get into an even bigger argument with more powerful people. Okay, so he spends 9 years writing this massive report that you've read and probably Tim's read and maybe a handful of other people.
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I think probably just me and Tim.
Yeah, so, and thank God you summarized it for us very, very eloquently and very quickly. Tim spends years, steps back, and looks at the big picture of how we're going to feed the global population in the face of this realization he's had that land is finite. One decision you make on a piece of cropland is going to affect forest land elsewhere in the world. So could you talk about the study and kind of the conclusion Tim comes to about where we are?
Sure. I mean, maybe this would be this will be a little bit of, this is the we are eating the earth problem.
Yes.
And again, I knew nothing about this. But one of the first things, one of the first facts I learned when I started thinking about this stuff is that 2 of every 5 acres of this planet are now cropped or grazed. That's kind of incredible. I mean, we know when we take a cross-country flight and you look out the window and you see all the squares and the circles, like we know there's a lot of ag out there. But, most of us live in cities or suburbs. Well, they cover 1 of every 100 acres of the planet, right? They're 1%. Ag is 40%, and it's growing every day. We're losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest every 6 seconds, and most of that is to ag. And those are just kind of astonishing facts when you think about it. And in a way, those are the kind of facts that once you hear them, you can't unhear them. It changes the way you think about the land. Because right now, what the framework for Tim's, the 564-page doorstop is that to feed, a growing population by 2050, we're going to need about 50% more calories. And right now, to provide those calories, if we kept on our current trajectory, we would have to deforest another 12 California's worth of land. And the thing is, we don't really have a 12 California's worth of forest to spare. We're also going to have to reduce agricultural emissions like 75-80% by 2050. And we are not on track to do any of those things. So that was the sort of, for Tim, that was that's the problem. And then he decided he was going to research all these solutions, which, remember, at this time, there was no blueprint. There really were no solutions. And so he went and looked on the demand side, how can we change our diets? We looked on the supply side, how can we change our farming? And he came up with this kind of menu of 22 different particular options, but each of those 22 options can also be, they're really, we're talking about just dozens and dozens of approaches. And then the kind of second half of the book, of my book, not Tim's report, is me kind of trying to check out if any of them are working. But Tim really, after cracking this biofuels case, which a lawyer had no right to do, he then decided to basically turn himself into a full-time scientist and crack the agriculture case. And this was really the first blueprint for how we could feed the world without frying the world.
And I just want to underscore this point of what he found again, of the problem that's in front of us, because you spend a lot of time in the book literally traveling the world looking at solutions that people are grappling, which is a real testament to human ingenuity and this hope that we can confront. But I need to underscore this problem for a second, because you and I have been talking about this book for a long time. I remember where I was sitting a couple years ago in that conference room when you laid this out for me, in the sense that over the next, and I've got it written down, I don't want to write it, but over the next 20 years, we're going to have to increase our agricultural output dramatically just to feed the growing world population, while at the same time reducing the carbon emissions from that land. And using at least only the massive amounts of land we're using now, or maybe even less than that. It's a problem from hell. It's a problem from hell. And it's quite sobering. I mean, you point out that by the year 2050, we're going to have to increase additional calories that add up to a large pepperoni pizza for every human being on Earth. And you also point every day, every day. That's a lot of calories. Yeah. And you also point out that there's some magical thinking going on in the scientific community because, you know, since the 1960s, we've seen the green revolution that dramatically increased how much food we can grow on every acre of land, the yield of crops. And a lot of people just assume that those yield increases are going to keep going. Well, they might or they might not. I mean, human ingenuity is astounding. The oil industry, for example, we thought we were hitting peak oil production, and fracking came along. As problematic as it is, it changed the equation. But we're still facing this dangerous bottleneck.
Yeah. And I was sort of giving you a somewhat optimistic view, that idea that we're going to have to deforest 12 Californias. That assumes that yields, that's basically how much food you can make per acre. And as you mentioned, like they've tripled since the Green Revolution. So without the Green Revolution, we'd be using 3 times as much land to grow this amount of food. And, you know, I mean, they talk about how there's no planet B, but we would kind of need one because we just, you know, we're already using an entire Asia plus an entire Europe to grow food. You know, we can't triple that. But that, again, if we increase yields at the same rate we've increased them since the Green Revolution, we will only need 12 more Californias worth of land for agriculture. If yields stayed flat, we would need 36 California's worth of land. And here's the thing, there's something that's going to make it really hard to increase yields in the future. It's this thing called climate change, which is sort of, you know, ironically or infuriatingly, is, you know, not only is our food system, you know, causing climate change, but our climate change affects our food system. And so as we're going to have, you know, more droughts, more heat waves, more floods, you know, the warmer weather is going to allow pests and crop diseases to migrate to new regions. I mean, they're talking that we could lose 1/3 of our wheat yields. You know, that would mean we'd need 1/3 more wheat land to grow the same amount of food, and we need more food. So again, no bueno.
No bueno, and let me please underscore, as you know, I write about agriculture a lot, and everything you're talking about, this is front of mind. From farmers in Missouri, wheat farmers in Kansas, to there's a war room inside Monsanto, or at least there was a few years ago, where they're studying climate change and how they're going to grapple with how much harder it's going to be to grow food. So this is the absolute downer part of this book. I find it quite sobering. And again, to this whole discussion we're having, it's this problem that we're so, I'm afraid to say it, but we're so ill-equipped to face problems like this that are long-term and that don't have a silver bullet solution, and that require a massive public focus on the problem. So let's get to, I think, the more exciting and happier parts in that, you know,
Are they though?
Well, let's pretend they are to have this nice event. And you know, you really did travel around the world looking at people putting their shoulder to the wheel to try to deal with this. And I mean, you look at a panoply of different potential solutions. And one of them, let's just get right into meat. Now, okay, trigger warning, we're in Kansas City. We love our barbecue. We love our barbecue in this town.
I went to Jack's Stack last night, and the manager told me that on a busy night, they go through 250 pounds of beef.
Well,
yeah.
Having read your book, how do you feel about that?
Well, I had the pork. Look, you know, I try not to get preachy about this stuff because you know, I have solar panels and an electric vehicle, but I fly way too much. And yes, when I started working on this book, I cut out beef and lamb because they are by far the worst foods that you can eat for the planet. They're like 10 times worse than chicken or pork. which are in turn, worse than beans or lentils. So going vegan is the best diet for the climate, but it turns out that cutting out beef and lamb is about as good as going vegetarian, because most vegetarians eat a lot of dairy, and like I said, cattle are really the problem. Now again, they produce milk several times a day, while in their entire lifetime they only produce beef once, which is what makes beef so particularly inefficient. But cattle, even chickens, like it takes like 8 or 9 calories of feed into a chicken to make 1 calorie of meat. But like I said, cattle are they're just spectacularly inefficient converters of their food into our food, which has some real, ruminant meat is the problem, and we're on track to eat 70% more of it. The world is by 2050, because again, the first, in some ways that's a good thing, because the first thing people tend to do when they stop being poor is to start eating meat. Right now there are like 6 billion people around the world who eat like no meat, and that's terrible. That's unfair. Americans, we eat 4 times the global average. But again, like you said, even if we cut our ruminant meat in half and cut food waste in half, and eliminated biofuels, we would still need to make a lot more food with a lot less land, so there really are no silver bullets to this stuff. But it is true that meat in general, the 350 million tons of meat that the world eats every year, and beef in particular, which uses half our agricultural land to produce 3% of our calories, that's really at the heart of the problem.
And we want to have a wonderful Q&A time with the crowd, and I think we're getting close to that. And so I would say you absolutely have to get this book, because in the latter part of the book, Michael, there's you explore the solutions to this problem. Cellular meat, which I'm sure you all have heard a lot about. Michael writes about the rise and fall of one of the largest cellular meat companies, and that
plant-based, yeah.
Plant-based, and that whole bubble. And then you go to feedlots, where people are doing some kind of like surprisingly straightforward reforms that could help reduce methane emissions from cattle. It's amazing. But, I'm going to take my prerogative to kind of ask my final question to you that I'm curious about, which is, I, as you know, interview a lot of people all across the political spectrum, and I've interviewed extremely intelligent people who tell me climate change is a hoax, full stop. So that doesn't help solve the problem. I think it's wrong just based on some pretty straightforward science. But, my question to you is, you've dedicated years to writing about this. This book makes a major progress in trying to solve this problem. Could you talk a little bit about your faith in the process of revealing truth in a democratic society to help us tackle problems, and how effective do you think it is right now? How effective is it to mobilize a society to address a major problem like this? Because that's what you're doing every day.
Not highly effective. Obviously, in some ways, journalism is sort of an act of faith, I guess, because you're hoping that somebody reads it, and then you're hoping that somebody gets it, and then maybe at some point that somebody does something about it. Like I could give you all this stuff about the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards truth and justice and the American way. The honest answer is I don't know. I do know that even some people who think climate change is a hoax, they're not going to read this book. And they're probably not going to pay attention to much of this stuff. And they're going to say like, oh, he just wants to ban cows, or he just wants us to eat bugs. I've heard all that stuff, and it's not really even that interesting a debate. And I think, I think it's unfortunate that a lot of these issues have gotten swept up in the culture war, right? So that, just as like electric cars became kind of Obama mobiles, then the sort of plant-based meat became Biden burgers and woke meat. It's ridiculous. I mean, these are, I feel like people of goodwill ought to get together and solve problems and all that. But the world doesn't really care what I think people ought to do. So I'm trying to put this out there. And again, you sort of alluded to this, but there's a lot in there. This idea that we need to make more food with less land leads to some kind of uncomfortable conclusions for people on the left too. For Al Gore, who's been a big, proponent of this idea that regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture, sort of if we just farm differently, you've probably seen documentaries like Kiss the Ground and Common Ground and Carbon Cowboys, this idea that all that, carbon that we pumped into the sky is going to sort of be miraculously repatriated into our soils. And that's almost entirely bogus. And so I did an event in Berkeley, and the famous regenerative organic chef Alice Waters was sitting in the third row glaring at me the whole time. So I don't know if I think there's certainly I tell these stories of Searchinger being dumped on because people didn't like what he had to say, and there's no doubt that I've in the now 4 or 5 days that my book has been out, but really since I wrote a sort of semi-defense of industrial agriculture in the New York Times like 6 months ago, I've been on the receiving end of a lot of this too, and I get it. Part of this is food, like so much of food and ag, has become extremely divided into these sort of silos, and they're not only red and blue silos, but it's also the vegan silo and the regenerative silo and the industrial silo. And part of my, I do believe that these, sort of uncharacteristically, maybe for me, but I am trying to be a little bit of a bridge builder. This idea that the different silos, if people stepped out of it, maybe they could learn something from each other. Will they? I honestly have no idea. I hope so. Maybe if everybody reads the book, you can report back to me on whether it's, changed your mind.
Who's not in a silo is Mother Nature. And
she bats last.
Yeah, and the imperatives of this thing might just be powerful enough to drive us to make the changes we need. I mean, it's either do it now or do it later kind of thing is how I see it.
Well, I do tell the story about Denmark, if we're gonna, again, I promise the book isn't entirely Debbie Downer. I do write about these very exciting solutions and these very cool people who are working on them. And then I do kind of mention towards the end, none of them actually have any traction yet, but they're very cool solutions. But, and then the politics too have really sucked just about everywhere. But Denmark, I went there in February 2020. I remember exactly when it was, because when I left, they asked me at the airport whether I'd been to China. And I was like, why are you asking me if I've been to China? There's there's some virus there. I don't know. It's apparently a bit really bad. I hadn't heard about it. But when I went with Searchinger, and at the time he was he had been hired by the Danish agricultural lobby, essentially, to help them decarbonize, because the rest of Denmark was already decarbonizing, everything except for agriculture. And even though they had incredible clout in Denmark, I think a larger percentage of Denmark is farmland than any other country except for Bangladesh. But suddenly it was their turn in the barrel. And so they were like, hey, suddenly all the environmentalists, they want to shut down our, they want us to get rid of our pigs and get rid of our dairy cows, and that seems kind of crazy. And the idea is that it was crazy because they have incredibly efficient, yes, horrible factory farms, but they were making more food with less land. And they could have shut down their factory farms, but then all of that production would have been outsourced to the developing world, and all the pollution and all the deforestation and just would have been done less efficiently. So Tim had these ideas like, well, actually we should, the government should be helping you to be even more efficient, and they should be investing in technologies that can improve your yields, but also technologies that can help you make less of a mess, that can help you manage your manure, that can help you produce your feed more efficiently, et cetera, et cetera. And then also, since you're not going to need as much land, you should return some of that to nature, and we can have some rewilding. And then Denmark, 5 years later, Denmark did it. They did all that stuff, and they passed a tax on agricultural emissions, which hasn't been passed anywhere else in the planet. I talked to a pollster in the US who said taxes on meat were the least popular policy he had ever polled. He said it was like veterans benefits for ISIS.
Yeah.
So it's like, but Denmark did, and I know it's Denmark. I know, right? They're like the model nation. They're like so good, it just shows that it can be done, and that is a message of all of this. Is that every one of these problems is really hard, and every one of these solutions has not panned out yet. Like the New Yorker, when they wrote about, wrote a very generous sort of summary of my book. What they said is that, all of these things he writes about all these solutions and they all turn out to be duds. And I would say they all just haven't panned out yet. And they also haven't had government investment yet. Talk about meat made from cells. There's been $3 billion of private and public, a tiny bit of public investment in its entire history. In the first quarter of this year, there was $250 billion in global investment in solar. Now, 20 years ago, when I started writing about energy, solar was nothing. Solar was, energy was where all this food stuff was. And now we've had this clean energy revolution. So, maybe we'll have a clean food revolution too.
Okay, questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was super interesting. You talked about land, but not water. And I think people who are paying attention to the climate, I hear a lot of stories about water. Not just the disappearance of it, but the salination of it. And so I just wonder how that fits into your...
Yeah, remember my first book was about the Everglades. Water issues are really close to my heart. And in fact, in the entire land sector, wetland restoration is probably the most bang for the buck, the best way to mitigate climate change. I want some billionaire to, could solve 2% of global emissions just by restoring drained peatlands. Agriculture uses 70% of the world's fresh water. When people say that the Colorado River is running dry, it's running dry because it's surrounded by alfalfa farms for livestock. You look at California, their groundwater is running dry, and they're expecting to have to fallow 500,000 acres of the most productive agriculture on the planet by not even by 2050, by 2035. And obviously, fallowing productive agriculture is not how you make more food with less land. So this isn't, specifically a water book, but water is absolutely at the heart of these issues. A lot when I talk about plant-based milks, people are always like, "Oh, well, I've heard almond milk is terrible because it uses so much water," and almond milk does use a ton of water, more than almost anything else except for cows, which use unbelievable amounts of water. So you're absolutely right to connect that, and it's part of this larger story of as we eat the earth, I guess we're drinking it too, right?
Yeah, I think your interviewer knows what my question's a little bit going to be, but one of the things about the agricultural community I think a lot of people don't realize, it's very powerful. They spend a lot of time educating their next generation of Aggies. I'm talking about the Future Farmers of America and 4-H, and FFA was considered the most influential, powerful youth group of all. You have, our Secretary of Agriculture was of FFA and whatever. And my question is this: if you found yourself in a convention of FFA kids, and they're, and the president of the Corn Growers Association sitting in the back row, with one or two paragraphs, could you say what message you would try to deliver to these young people who are the future secretaries of agriculture and the whole nine yards? What would be your message to them? Thank you.
Sure. Well, that's a great question. And so certainly, and I have talked to people like that, not to a future farmers group, but I've certainly been in the middle of ag groups. And one thing I would say is that, like, climate change is coming for you too, right? It's your problem too, and we discussed that a little bit. Then, the kind of tough love I tried to give farmers, because the farmers, I spent a lot of time with them, and mostly I find them to be like incredibly smart, incredibly competent. They're kind of alchemizing sunlight and soil and rain into nutrition for the world, and it's really amazing what they do. And many of them do it really incredibly efficiently. And so, as I always say, like, as they often remind us, we do owe them a great debt. That said, they talk a lot about how they care about their stewardship of the land. And many of them really do care deeply about that, about their soil. Exactly, about their soil. And what I say to them is, like, I believe you, but collectively you are stewarding a mess. And it's not a sustainable mess. And that at some point, what's happened in Denmark is going to happen to you. That people are going to say, like, hey, we're trying to force everybody else to clean up their act. You've got to do it too. And it happens that my message, particularly the emphasis on efficiency in the United States, that's music to a lot of farmers' ears here, right? Because American farmers are really efficient. Right? Like an American dairy cow produces as much milk as 23 Indian dairy cows. And so that's like, it's like the difference between 23 cars on the road or a bus carrying 23 people from an environmental perspective. It really is better. Essentially, like, ag guys have so much power. Like, around the world spends $600 billion a year subsidizing agriculture. And I don't really expect that to change. But what I've told them, what I do expect to change is there has to be more of a grand bargain where, we will help you make even more food. We are going to continue to support you because what you do is important, but you really have to make less of a mess. And the main way of making less of a mess, and this is where everybody who's read Michael Pollan hates me, but is to and he writes beautifully, so I don't mean to pick on him. I sort of wish he didn't write so beautifully, but he's given this notion that, like, there's kind of like nice, romantic, salt of the earth, kinder and gentler, natural farming. That's part of the climate solution, and then there's the kind of big evil industrial farming that is bad. And in fact, the real environmental disaster is the transformation of nature into agriculture, even into those nice Michael Pollan farms. That's when you lose the carbon. That's when you lose the biodiversity. And so I would say to those people that you have, like, the last words of the book. God, I'm really doing spoiler alerts. Are every acre is sacred. It's not like me saying that, but it's in the context. And I think that we have to think of farmland that way. That if it isn't storing a lot of carbon, it better be making a lot of food.
They're young enough that they will experience that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Do you know the book, Vegans Have Smaller Brains?
I don't, but I do know the evolutionary history of.
Well, it would be quite a bit different view than you have. They're recommending, there's 3 scientists wrote the book, and they're recommending beef and lamb as the best choice for the environment.
Yeah, they're wrong. And I hate to, you hear a lot that it's not the cow, it's the how. And there is something to, the how matters, but it is mostly the cow. But again, like, it really matters a lot whether cattle, take up 10 times as much land as and generate 10 times as many emissions as chickens, or 3 times. And just like Willie Sutton said that he he robbed banks because that's where the money is. If you care about emissions, you should care about beef because that's where the emissions are. You should care about cattle. And I did go to Brazil and saw some incredibly productive ranches that are gonna, and vegans hate this too. But the answer isn't just to eat less beef. It's also that, we have to make the beef that we do make more efficiently. And that is not, the sort of organic, twee, grass-fed beef. That's actually even worse for the climate. It is making, having more cows on less land. And I saw degraded ranches that had one cow for every 6 or 7 acres. And I saw incredibly productive ranches that had 1 cow per acre. So we're using 1/6 or 1/7 as much as the Amazon. And that is really important. And those, by the way, those ranches, to get a little bit back on Michael Pollan's good side, they did some things he wouldn't like. They would fertilize their pastures, and they have feedlots. So boo, bad. But they also did a lot of regenerative practices. They had rotational grazing. They let the cows sort of graze on their cover crops. So that's an example of how I think all of the the vegans and the regenerative people and the industrial people can all learn from each other.
I heard you speak tonight about mostly supply side answers to our food problems. On the demand side, I heard you talk about what we're eating. I'm wondering if anyone is having the discussion of how much we're eating. Like when you mentioned about a pepperoni, an additional pepperoni pizza per person. Is anybody talking about limits on total consumption?
Sure, in the rich world especially, and obviously, and there are a lot of us in the rich world who could stand to eat a few, stand to have a few fewer calories, and actually, Ozempic and drugs like it could actually have a measurable impact on in the rich world, particularly on global food demand. That said, the numbers are we're talking about quadrillions of calories here, and the extent to which there is absolutely a need for many in the rich world. We take in too many calories, and that should be reduced. But globally, there's just a desperate need for more, and even if you reduce what the ideal American diet was going to be, and hopefully you don't see China adopting the American diet, which is a real danger. I still think on the demand side, things like meat substitutes are going to be really important. I've written about some of the kind of various nudges that you can use to get people to eat less beef. But also wasting less food. So if you want your list of, I can give you a list of 30 things you could do to help your diet get greener, but honestly the 2 are so important that the rest don't matter that much. It's eat less beef and waste less food. And because when you waste food, and we waste 1/4 of our food, you waste the farmland and the fertilizer and the water that's used to grow that food. And, in addition to the average American family wastes $1,500 a year on food that goes in the garbage, the world is using a land mass the size of China to grow food that goes in the garbage. Those are demand side fixes that could make a real difference.
I think we'll finish up, Christopher, with these 2 questions in line.
Thank you. And I apologize if I've gone on long. Sir, your question.
Thank you, and thank you to the library for hosting this presentation. It's been excellent.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
It's obvious that there are no easy answers. One of the things that causes me to rise is that I think there's a perception in the room that electric vehicles are the future. I differ. I would point out that every electric vehicle comes factory equipped with some very nasty things that have happened somewhere else in the world, including greenhouse gas emissions that are charged against somebody else's balance sheet. I have put a post on Facebook that outlines some of the problems that I see. If you'll search for hashtag EV questions, You'll get a perspective. I don't know all the answers. I'm not an expert, but I think we need to be asking a lot of questions about EVs.
You got it. And let's lump these together. Sir, do you have a question? I would love to get you in. Sorry if we went too long.
Mine, back in the 60s and 70s, when I'd have 3 or 4 days off, we'd hop in the car and go driving. And so many of the roads had 90-degree and 135-degree turns, but the road dealt with the contour of the earth. But what we do now is the rain isn't getting back to the aquifilter because we got the clover leaves, earth movers, so the natural contours of the land isn't there anymore, and the water don't know where to go. So my question is, why? How are we going to fix that now that we got all this infrastructure and still nowhere for the water to go?
You got it. Thank you. And wrap together, Michael, what do you think?
I have to say, and I don't know to that one.
Well, I think complicated problems, inherited infrastructure, the supply chains of electric vehicles, and the one thing I'll say about Michael's book, the thing you emphasize again and again, there's no silver bullet to this thing.
Yeah.
It's human ingenuity and concentrated public focus. So Michael, thank you for writing this book. Thanks for talking about it in Kansas City, and I hope you sign some for the folks here. So thanks for coming, man.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.